September 3, 1944. A forward mess facility. Somewhere between the Moselle River and the German border, northeastern France. The confrontation began over a table, not a command decision, not a tactical order. A table inside a canvas mess tent that had been erected on French soil by American engineers, fed by American rations, staffed by American cooks, one of whom was black, and several of whose fellow soldiers had sat down to eat beside white soldiers from a line infantry unit rotating through the facility. 4 white soldiers from the 35th Infantry Division stood up. They did not leave. They stood in place and refused to sit back down until the black soldiers moved to a separate eating area. They said this loudly enough that the mess sergeant, a white staff sergeant from Georgia, heard it from the serving line. Loudly enough that the other 12 men in the tent heard it. Loudly enough that it was in the incident report that reached 3rd Army headquarters by 1800 hours that evening. The report also noted that the 4 men had cited Army precedent. Segregation was policy. They were following it. They had paperwork on their side. What they did not have was any idea that the incident report had been flagged personally for Patton, and that he was already writing his response. To understand what Patton wrote, you must understand the precise military and strategic context of September 1944 and what it had done to the Army's ability to enforce its own segregation policies in the field. 3rd Army had been activated in France on August 1, 1944, and in 33 days had advanced 400 miles, liberated 48,000 square miles of territory, and consumed logistics at a rate that had outrun the entire Allied supply system. By September 1st, 3rd Army's tanks were running on fumes. Literally. The fuel shortage that halted Patton's advance at the German border in early September 1944 was the single most consequential logistical failure of the Western campaign, and it had one primary cause. The Allied supply network could not move fuel from the Normandy beaches to the German border fast enough to sustain the pace of the advance. The men moving that fuel, in the truck convoys of the Red Ball Express, which operated 24 hours a day from August 25 through November 16, 1944, covering 700 miles of French road and delivering 412,000 tons of supplies, were, by significant majority, black American soldiers. Approximately 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were black. Without them, 3rd Army stopped. The arithmetic was not subtle. Patton knew the arithmetic. He had known it since August. He had visited Red Ball Express convoys. He had spoken to the drivers. He understood, with the operational clarity of a man who measured everything in miles per day and gallons per mile, exactly who was keeping his army moving. The 4 men who stood up in that mess tent had not done that arithmetic. The Army regulation they had cited, specifically the policies derived from War Department Circular 124 of 1942, and the standing segregation orders for the European theater, was real. It was active. It had force of institutional authority behind it that no field commander, including Patton, could simply dissolve with a memo. The 4 soldiers knew this. The mess sergeant knew it. The processing officer who filed the incident report knew it. The report's language was carefully neutral. It described a disturbance related to seating arrangements in compliance with standing segregation policy, but the neutrality was itself a position. It framed what had happened as a compliance matter, a policy enforcement issue, something to be resolved by reference to the applicable regulation. Patton read it as something entirely different. He read it as an operational problem, not a social problem, not a political problem. An operational problem with a specific, measurable cost to 3rd Army's combat effectiveness and logistical sustainability at the exact moment in the campaign when both were under maximum stress. The German perspective on this moment is provided by Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group G, opposite 3rd Army's eastern axis in September 1944. His intelligence assessment, filed September 5, 1944, described 3rd Army's supply situation as critically strained and assessed that any degradation of American logistical cohesion in this period would substantially benefit German defensive prospects on the Moselle line. Blaskowitz was monitoring the Red Ball Express. His intelligence officers had counted the trucks. They knew who was driving them. What Blaskowitz did not know was that inside Third Army, someone was trying to make those drivers eat in a separate tent. The numbers told a story nobody in that mess tent wanted to hear. Patton's response arrived at the 35th Infantry Division's headquarters on the morning of September 4, 1944. It was not a reprimand. It was not a formal censure of the 4 soldiers involved. It was a command directive, issued over Patton's signature, addressed to all unit commanders in Third Army's operational area, and it contained language that his staff had not seen him use in any previous administrative communication. The directive stated that Third Army was conducting combat operations in a sustained offensive requiring continuous logistical support across an extended supply line. It stated that the effective functioning of that supply line depended on the performance of all assigned personnel, regardless of their race, unit designation, or assignment type. It then stated, without softening, that any act, including the disruption of shared facilities based on racial grounds, that degraded the operational cohesion of Third Army's support personnel would be treated as an act detrimental to Third Army's combat effectiveness, and handled accordingly. It did not cite civil rights. It did not cite moral principle. It cited operational necessity with the same tone and precision that Patton used when directing tank maintenance schedules and fuel allocation priorities. His operations officer, Brigadier General Halley Maddox, noted in his diary on September 5 that the directive had caused significant discomfort at division and regimental level, meaning that the commanders receiving it understood exactly what it was and exactly what it was not. It was not a policy change. Army segregation remained the formal structure. What it was a commander telling his subordinates that he would not tolerate the operational expression of that policy in ways that damaged his army's fighting capacity. The distinction was precise. And it was designed to be. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Williams, commanding officer of a Red Ball Express Motor Transport Battalion operating in Third Army's supply corridor, learned of the directive through his chain of command on September 6, 1944. Williams was black. His battalion had driven continuously for 12 days at that point, averaging 19 hours of operation per day, delivering fuel that kept Third Army's Shermans moving toward Germany. He did not learn of the directive from Patton directly. He learned of it the way most soldiers learn of command decisions, through the filter of his immediate superiors, in language that had been translated and summarized by the time it reached him. What he understood, according to his post-war account recorded by Army historian Ulysses Lee in the 1966 study The Employment of Negro Troops, was that Third Army's commanding general had made it plain that the men driving the fuel were the same as the men burning it. The same, not equal in abstract principle, the same in operational fact. Williams said in that account that the directive had produced an immediate and measurable effect on morale in his battalion. He described it not as inspiration, but as something more specific, as relief. The relief, he said, of men who had been told explicitly that what they were doing mattered, and that the army they were doing it for acknowledged the fact in writing. On the German side, the operational consequence was direct. Blaskowitz's September 5 assessment of Third Army's supply situation as critically strained was revised on September 12. His updated assessment rated the Red Ball Express delivery rate as having stabilized at a level sufficient to sustain limited offensive operations. The fuel was getting through. The trucks were still running. The drivers were still driving. Blaskowitz's intelligence officers had been watching for signs of degradation in the American supply system. They were watching for the friction that racial tension inside an army produces. The absenteeism, the reduced efficiency, the quiet slowdowns of men who have decided that the organization they serve does not fully claim them. They were watching for the crack. It did not appear. Patton had closed it before it could open. November 7, 1944. The 761st Tank Battalion arrived at Third Army. The connection between the September 3rd mess tent incident and the November 7th activation of the 1st Black Armored Unit in the European theater is not a straight line. It is a pattern of decisions that Patton made throughout September, October, and November 1944 that collectively produced a Third Army where black soldiers, in support roles, in logistics, and now in combat armor, operated under a commander whose standard was uniform and whose directive of September 4th had established the terms. Patton stood before the 761st on November 7th and said words that Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the battalion's commanding officer, recorded and repeated in every subsequent interview about the event. "I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." It was not elegant. It was not the language of a progressive. It was the language of a man who had already settled the question operationally and was communicating the settlement in terms his army understood. The counterintuitive truth at the center of this entire sequence is this: Patton's desegregation of Third Army's operational environment was not motivated by principle. It was motivated by arithmetic. He had counted the trucks. He had calculated the gallons. He had measured the miles. And when 4 soldiers stood up in a mess tent and threatened the human machinery that kept his army moving, he had responded not with moral argument, but with operational logic, the only language a segregated army could hear without triggering the institutional defenses that moral argument immediately provoked. He did not tell the army it was wrong. He told his army it was inefficient. And in September 1944, on the banks of the Moselle River, with German armor 30 miles east and fuel gauges dropping across every Sherman in Third Army, inefficient was the most powerful word in the military vocabulary. The 4 soldiers who stood up had been following policy. They had been following it correctly, and Patton had rendered their correct policy following operationally irrelevant by the simplest possible method, by making clear that the cost of the policy in that army, at that moment, was one he was not prepared to pay. German commanders watching Third Army's logistics had been waiting for the friction to show. It never showed. The trucks ran. The fuel arrived. The Shermans moved. And the men who drove the trucks ate in the same tent as the men whose tanks they were feeding. Not because of a moral revolution. Because one general had done the arithmetic. The operational record provides 4 distinct layers of confirmation for what Patton's September 4th directive accomplished and what its absence would have cost. The first is logistical. The Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies between August 25th and November 16th, 1944, an average of 958 tons per day across a 700-mile round trip through French road networks that had been partially destroyed by Allied bombing. The delivery rate never fell below the minimum threshold required to sustain Third Army's operations during that period. The trucks ran without significant organized disruption. The drivers maintained their schedules. The second is statistical. Third Army's fuel consumption in September and October 1944 averaged 400,000 gallons per day. Every gallon of that fuel arrived by truck. The majority of those trucks were driven by black soldiers. The delivery continuity those soldiers maintained was the single non-negotiable logistical requirement of Third Army's entire autumn campaign. Without it, the Moselle crossings, the Saar offensive, and the preparation for the Ardennes response all become impossible. The third is enemy assessment. Blaskowitz's revised intelligence estimate of September 12th, moving from critically strained to sufficient for limited offensive operations, represents the German acknowledgement that the American supply system had not degraded as expected. His analysts had been watching for racial friction as a combat multiplier for Germany. They did not find it. The fourth is the 761st Tank Battalion's record. In 183 days of continuous combat from November 1944 to May 1945, the battalion achieved performance ratings from attached division commanders that the Army's own post-war assessment, published in 1946, described as equal to comparable white armored elements. The battalion that Patton put into the line in November had been made possible, in part, by a command climate established 2 months earlier in a mess tent on the Moselle. One directive. Written in the language of operational necessity. Measured in gallons per day and miles per hour. Samuel Williams finished the war as a lieutenant colonel and returned to civilian life in 1945. His battalion's record, the miles driven, the tons delivered, the days and nights on French roads in rain and darkness and German air attack, was incorporated into the Army's official history of black soldiers in World War II. Published in 1966. The study documented what the Red Ball Express had contributed to the Allied victory in Western Europe, with statistical precision that left no room for ambiguity. The 4 soldiers who stood up in the mess tent on September 3, 1944, are not identified by name in any available record. The incident report that reached Patton described the event, the unit, the facility, and the outcome. It did not record their names. They are in the arithmetic somewhere, in the units, in the rosters, in the casualty records of men who fought in the European theater, but not in the incident report. Patton's directive of September 4th is in the record. Permanently. The principle it embodies is not military and not historical. It is present in every organization that has ever tried to sustain performance while tolerating internal friction that consumes the capacity it needs. The most powerful argument against exclusion is never moral. It is operational. Show the arithmetic. Count what the excluded contribute. Calculate what their exclusion costs. Then, write the directive. Not because it is right. Because the Army cannot move without the fuel.